Welcome to episode 30 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hello there.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode. New episodes are out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite podcasting platform to get the latest first. Ratings and reviews are appreciated, and you can drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening, and now, without further ado, let's jump in to highlighting our most recently added segment, Ransomware Reckoning.
It's time for Ransomware Reckoning, in which our Firewalls.com colleague Andrew Nita shines a spotlight on a high-profile ransomware case. Because unfortunately, there are plenty to choose from, and even more unfortunately, in this case, are potential coronavirus-related implications.
On September 20th, the company ERT announced that ransomware had seized its systems. The results of the attack on the health tech firm left drug and health research companies crippled by the seizure of their data. One of ERT's clients, IQVIA, is playing a large role in the AstraZeneca and Bristol Myers COVID vaccine trials. ERT has not said how many clinical trials were affected, but they have a worldwide presence and play a large role in 3/4 of all drug approval trials issued by the FDA. It's unknown if the ransom had been paid, but the company's spokesman did say, "Nobody feels great about these experiences, but this has been contained." Regardless, if ERT paid the ransom, it's becoming all too common to see large enterprises pay for their critical data, a trend we hope declines. Stay tuned to the Ping podcast for your updates on ransomware all across the globe.
Now it's time for headlines. In this regular segment, we take a closer look at a few top stories in the cybersecurity world and what they may mean to you. Let's jump right into headline number 1. And this is a two-parter. Ransomware victims aren't reporting attacks to police. That's causing a big problem. That's part 1. And part 2, ransomware victims that pay up could incur steep fines from Uncle Sam. So as Andrew Nita just highlighted here on Ping in this episode and in some previous episodes, you may have heard ransomware is a pretty big problem. In this case, these two stories illustrate just how complicated the ransomware issue is for victims.
Right, so the first part of this story, in which ransomware victims are not properly reporting attacks to the police, this particular issue comes from Europol's annual cyber crime report called the Internet Organized Crime Threat Assessment 2020. And just as the title says, a lot of times when a company is being targeted by ransomware, they simply choose to take matters into their own hands or third-party services' hands and avoid law enforcement altogether.
Yeah, and this is organized with an S. That's how you know it's from Europe instead of the U.S. But several agencies that they talk about in this particular story, in the report rather, say they've only heard about certain ransomware attacks via the news. So just like anybody else, you hear about your ransomware attack of the day on the news, and that's a little troubling for the law enforcement agencies because they can't really do anything about it at that point.
Right, so the report does cover a few reasons as to why this trend is happening. In one case, obviously, a lot of these companies are concerned with getting things back up and running as normal, and when you get police involved, and perhaps in that case as well, media, it all becomes quite a big public spectacle. So a lot of companies are choosing just to quietly sweep it under the rug and trying to get back to normal without any other sort of intervention.
Yeah, they don't want to deal with extra interruptions to business, and also, of course, the big one that we always talk about is the reputational damage that can occur from any kind of cyber breach. And we know that there are reputational issues that happen if the story comes out a little bit later, too. But a lot of them are still hoping, a lot of the businesses are still hoping that maybe nobody will notice this, we can pay the ransom, and move on with our lives like nothing happened.
Right, and a lot of the third-party like insurance companies that we've mentioned, they actually encourage people to pay that ransom because in a lot of cases that is actually the cheaper option when compared recovery and recuperation. All those costs can really add up. In many cases, just paying a few Bitcoin is much easier.
Yeah, and so the report does say that private security firms are being engaged by these companies to not only investigate the attacks, but even negotiate those ransom payments. And law enforcement advises against paying those ransoms. And there are a couple of reasons for that, and we'll get into one of the other ones in a little bit. But Europol says it's important that law enforcement become aware of all attacks to learn more about them, to be able to better investigate perpetrators, aid victims, and potentially prevent future attacks. So those are all pretty legitimate reasons. And the other interesting thing is another reason why victims say they don't report. It's because they don't believe that law enforcement can do anything to help.
Right, and at first sniff, that kind of makes sense. Whatever, if you call 911 and they dispatch a patrol car out to your business, what are they really going to do? But obviously, that's not the end of it. They don't just say, well, we can't do anything and shrug and walk off. Usually, there's a special task force involved, obviously escalated to other agencies that specialize in that area. So I can see why, on the surface level, people would believe that law enforcement can't really be of any help, but I don't think there's truth to that assumption.
We've done a story or two, I think, where it was basically outlined that some law enforcement agencies weren't really able to do a whole lot. But by the same token, sometimes they can, and there's definitely complications in cybersecurity because usually the perpetrator is not right down the street from you, so you're dealing with another country and jurisdictional issues and all sorts of things like that. But sometimes there are agreements in Europe. I'm sure there are agreements between law enforcement in different countries. So if somebody is a few countries away, then they may still be able to do something about that with the local investigation, or more of the overarching EU authorities could get involved as well.
Right, and this piece also touches on some of the more practical implications of why law enforcement should be looped in on these as well. So there are a few tools that they have on offer, which this sort of sharing of threat intelligence could very well benefit from.
Yeah, the tool in particular that they talk about in this piece, which is one that I had not heard of before, it's from Europol, and it's called No More Ransom. It's a portal which actually offers free decryption keys for various families of ransomware, which are curated from cybersecurity companies and law enforcement agencies that have broken some ransomware encryption.
Right, and obviously this tool will become more useful and recognize more of these ransomware families if people are reporting those attacks to the law enforcement so that they are aware of them, which is pretty straightforward logic.
Yeah, if a ransomware type just remains a secret and the attack is done and you pay the ransom and nobody ever knows about it, then nobody ever knows about it. And so the next person will not have any resources at their disposal other than basically the same corner that you've been painted into, either pay the ransom or hope that you have some kind of backup solution in place, or hope that law enforcement magically finds them on the first try. So
yes, and if you also don't report, you might not be made aware of this tool, and if you do end up making a payment for a ransomware that's already been cracked by this portal, then you just kind of wasted some pretty big bucks there.
Yeah, this tool really seems to be one of the first places you should go after notifying law enforcement that you've been attacked. See if there's something in there that you might be able to use and get back to normal. Of course, you always want to have those backups in place so that you have your own options outside of having to decrypt the ransomware, but that's just another tool in the toolbox out there.
Yeah, the defense in depth on many different strategies.
So that's part one, and now we come back across the pond to the United States with the Department of Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, as noted in this piece because we can't go without an acronym. They released an advisory saying companies that facilitate ransomware payments to cyber actors on behalf of victims, including financial institutions, cyber insurance firms, and companies involved in digital forensics and incident response, not only encourage future ransomware payment demands, but also may risk violating OFAC regulations.
Right, and so this particular office, the Office of Foreign Assets Control, as you said, is particularly concerned with entities that might have been sanctioned by the U.S. government, and so doing any sort of transactional business with these entities would be considered illegal.
Yeah, a federal crime. And some of those under sanctions are pretty well-known groups, including a couple we've mentioned here on Ping before, including North Korea's Lazarus Group, Russia-based Evil Corp, which has been in the news a lot recently, plus the developer of CryptoLocker, an original ransomware type, and people tied to SamSam ransomware as well.
Right, and it's believed that the creators of SamSam, or at least the most well-known users of SamSam, are based out of Iran, a country with plenty of sanctions surrounding them. So this idea is so prevalent, in fact, that a lot of cyber insurance companies will go ahead and contact OFAC, and they may not even choose to take a case based on who the group is or what ransomware you've been infected with.
Yeah, they kind of know how the game is played, so they won't even jump into a situation that may lead to further payment issues. I don't know if they'd be liable in some way. Probably would, I guess, if you're transacting in any way, shape, or form.
Right.
So they don't want to get involved in all that.
Correct. And so you have all these different insurance companies who are, on one hand, recommending that you do pay the ransom. You have the government and Europol and law enforcement saying, don't pay the ransom. And it's all very confusing when you get to the level of the victim who just wants to do their job and go about their day.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much calculus. And at the beginning of this story, we talked about how complicated an issue ransomware is, because it isn't just mitigate and move on. You have to weigh a bunch of different factors in order to determine what your best course of action is. So, as we said, law enforcement discourages paying the ransoms. A couple of the reasons, in addition to the potential of sanctions in this case for some, are that, one, you don't know for sure that paying the ransom is going to get you made whole right away.
You are dealing with criminals, so...
You are dealing with criminals. And two, if you do pay the ransom, then obviously the criminals will go, well, that was worth it, so let's do it again.
Load it back up for round two.
Yeah, whether it's aimed at you or aimed at somebody else. So there are good reasons not to. But again, by the same token, if you're a company, you just want to get your data back and make this go away so that we can move forward. So there is that factor in the equation as well.
Well, the OFAC office, as we mentioned here, does sort of give a little extra oomph behind the idea or the argument that you should tell law enforcement, as they will consider a company's own self-reporting to law enforcement as a mitigating factor in determining appropriate enforcement. So if you do find yourselves running afoul of sanctions, they might be a little more forgiving of you if you have gotten law enforcement done and involved and done your due diligence along the way.
Yeah, and the other thing is this piece mentions that victims may receive, it doesn't explain how this happens, but there could be some sort of special permission or license that they could receive that may help them avoid penalties as well. But again, that involves getting out in front of it and reporting it quickly. But some of those penalties, we're talking about fines up to $20 million. That's probably going to be more than any ransom.
I would assume so. If your ransom's $20 million, then you got some big problems.
Yeah, and this is whether the victims know about the sanctions or not. So if you're a company that's just been victimized by ransomware and your first instinct is, okay, let's go pay it. You pay it, don't do any more research. Then you find out later on, maybe you get a call from the Office of the Treasury saying that you're subject to civil penalties in this case, and you have to pay another fine. Because it is a civil penalty, they don't require the quote-unquote mens rea, which is the reason to know element that is required in the criminal arena. And so you still have to pay one way or the other.
So thinking of all this calculus involved, what do you think is the bigger reputation damage? Violating international sanctions or losing some customer data?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've said fairly consistently on here that it's better to just get out in front of this, not necessarily embrace it, but
be transparent about it.
Be transparent about it. Tell who you need to tell. Don't try and hide anything, and it'll go away faster that way.
With the smaller fallout later down the road.
Yeah. Once it's done that way. Whereas if you try to keep it a secret, there are all sorts of things that could still happen even years later that could end up hurting you a lot worse. Now, headline number 2. Truncated URLs look to make big dent in phishing. So this one's a more optimistic story. Google's Chrome 86 browser, just coming out in stable version, really as we record this, October 6th is listed as the date for it. will only display the primary domain name in the URL, reducing the amount of information displayed to the user so they can focus on the domain alone.
Right, so a little example for anyone confused. For example, with the URL for this story, www.darkreading.com/risk/truncated blah 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 /div / a bunch of numbers, that would instead just read www.darkreading.com on your browser. Everything past that will be hidden.
Yeah, so basically what it's meant to do is reduce the threat of phishing by taking away a lot of the text available in URLs that hackers can manipulate to try and trick victims into thinking they're browsing at the site that they mean to be browsing to instead of their fake site that's going to steal all their data.
Right, so things like typo squatting or malicious URLs sent through email might be a little easier to recognize if it says drakreading.com. Give that all the extra shenanigans afterwards to sort of distract the user's eyes as they're assessing the link.
Drak does have a really interesting blog, though. So,
It's about his favorite books, Drak Reading.
But yeah, so anything that makes phishing a little more visible and kind of pulls back the curtain should be a pretty good thing. And we know that it's a ongoing threat that really ties into a lot of the malware that's out there and data loss that's out there, because phishing email can be a point of entry for just about anything, whether it be ransomware, which we just talked about, or just about anything else, a virus, etc. And that can affect individuals, or one individual making that same mistake on their employer network can cause a much bigger problem.
Right, and I imagine we will also quickly see attackers adjusting their strategies to sort of deal with this and find workarounds, because literally they always do.
They always do, and of course there are plenty of ways that even on the surface level you can see that phishing will continue one way or the other. So many attackers in this piece notes have moved on to other strategies that hide their illegitimate sites within legitimate domains. So this way, their illegitimate darkreading.com site would still say darkreading.com because they were able to hide it within that legitimate domain. So in that respect, it made me wonder if this actually makes it harder to identify phishing in that type of case.
Right, if you are the kind of person that's reading your URLs to make sure that they're legitimate, you're also probably the kind of person that benefits from more information rather than less. So
Yeah.
I kind of agree on that point. It also does not take into account the idea of these smishing type attacks where links are being sent through text.
Mhm.
Obviously on mobile devices the URLs tend to be either smaller or hidden altogether, so maybe not readily available to inspect still.
Yeah, and we don't know for sure with the new version of Chrome if there are settings to mess around with that will make it not too difficult for you to read the full address if you're a little bit suspicious or something of that nature. But going back, in general, it seems like it's a step that's positive. It's a good idea to try to do what's out there, try to limit some phishing options out there for people. And, you know, a lot of the people who do succumb to a phishing attack would benefit from more of a surface level visibility that they might not see normally.
Right, so speaking of which, the author of this article, Dr. Salvatore Stolfo, while he does give Google its kudos, he also recognizes that this is kind of putting the burden of security back on the user. Again, you are now expected to read that domain name and ensure that it is legitimate, whereas perhaps the more effective strategy is to make sure you never get to that URL or get to a chance to attempt to click it in the first place.
Right. He's suggesting that there need to be more tools out there to stop phishing attacks automatically. And, you know, there are tools out there. We know that there are email security platforms out there that continue to evolve their AI ability to screen out phishing emails. And a lot of times they do catch a lot of those spam, malicious emails on the way in.
Right, so this is definitely ammo in that toolbox, but not a silver bullet for sure.
No, it needs to be a combination, again, as we say all the time. You need to have your security tools in place, and then you need training in place, and hopefully this helps with the training aspect where people are better equipped to recognize those bad emails. Now, headline number 3. Hackers stole a 6-figure amount from Swiss universities. So, in another example of how cyber attacks aimed at organizations can affect the average person, just like what we talked about in our last episode with the actual death of an individual because a hospital was affected by ransomware. In this case, threat actors have managed to steal employee salary payments at several Swiss universities, including the University of Basel.
Yeah, so apparently this was done through a spear phishing attack that affected at least 3 universities in this story. So this was a link or attachment likely being sent to professors at the university, and apparently a few fell for it.
Yeah, and the difference between a regular phishing attack and a spear phishing attack is there's a lot more targeting involved in spear phishing, and it could have been something that looked like it came from the university president asking somebody to do something for them, those types of things. So it's a little bit more evolved and a little bit more difficult to spot spear phishing than your average phishing email.
Right, and so the idea behind this attack was after the system was compromised, hackers then rerouted the salary transfers to professors into their own accounts, so quite literally stealing their living from them.
Yeah, so you just change the account number on the paychecks and they go to you direct deposit instead. And in this case, the funds were apparently immediately moved to foreign accounts. So as far as the information we have in the story so far, it doesn't look like the money has been recovered as of yet.
Right. The umbrella organization known as Swiss University sent out a warning email letting all the university staff know and keep an eye out for this. Apparently, the University of Zurich has already stopped a similar attack without being victimized, so they were successful in avoiding this particular attack.
Yeah, we don't know if it was stopped because somebody recognized the bad email right off the bat or if the warning email kind of came out and then they knew. We don't know exactly what the timeline was, whether this was sort of coordinated and happened all around the same time or over the course of a certain period of time. But it does say that a 6-figure amount was stolen. So, I mean, 6 figures has a lot of range. It could be $100,000, it could be $999,000, but either way, it's not an insignificant sum. And again, if it's affecting employees, we don't know if the universities have quickly paid them correctly to make up for it and are bearing the burden themselves, which I would think they would. But if they don't, then that means there's actually people who are missing a paycheck.
Right, and as you said, there's not a whole lot of information surrounding this story past sort of just the surface level here, but this is a pretty good demonstration of, yet again, the cybersecurity world crossing over into the real world and having quite real impacts on our lives, which makes sense as we live in a more connected world every year. So I imagine we'll see many similar stories like this coming out, maybe not specifically with university salaries, but several other types of real world implications.
Yeah, I mean, as we just talked about, we already saw it in the hospital situation. The hospital being affected by ransomware made it so that somebody couldn't be cared for there and actually died. We have this situation where people lose their salaries. We have, a lot of other things that could happen with bank account information being affected. We talked, I think, last year on an episode about, or maybe we didn't talk about it, but we read about it, a story involving attacks on airlines too, which could mess with air traffic safety. We also have road traffic control devices that could easily be hacked as well. So lots of things that would really bring home how cybersecurity is really important to you.
Right, so things like firewalls and network switches and endpoint, that's no longer just the matter for small businesses and enterprises to be discussing. It's something that impacts everybody in their daily lives in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, and that's really what this is meant to underline, I think, is that, you go about your day-to-day at the office, and yeah, you would feel bad if your employer was the victim of a cyber attack, but you might not think, it's bad, but, they'll take care of it and we'll move on and it won't really affect me. But there are lots of ways that it could affect you very, very deeply.
Yeah, you could wake up one morning and find that you don't have rent this month.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed. Subscribe or follow now however you listen to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available. And please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode. But in the meantime, we remind you to
Get secure, stay secure.